Hello, everyone. Welcome to the ZOA Book Club. Today, we're very honored to have my friend Yisrael Hacohen speaking about his beloved father's book, Homeland, From Clandestine Immigration to Israeli Independence. I was fortunate enough to hear many of the stories in this book directly from Dr. Mordecai Hacohen when I had dinner over at the Hacohen family, and I'm really excited to hear Yisrael speak about this. And with that, I am very pleased to turn this over to Yisrael Hacohen. Yisrael, please go ahead. Thanks.
Hey, thank you. First, I want to express my appreciation to the Zionist Organization of America's Book Club and to Liz and to Alan for the opportunity to discuss my father's memoirs and also reflect on his life. Often readers like to know a little more about the background of the author of a book. So besides what you find in the back of flaps, so one of my goals is to give you a little bit of a run-up to how the book finally did get written and add some of the observations about my dad and things that I learned from his achievements. As Liz mentioned, my parents very often had guests over for meals and for conversation. And when I was growing up, I didn't initially appreciate who the participants of these intriguing conversations about areas of concern to the Jewish community. I didn't know who they were. And other times I just was fascinated by the stories of events that they shared. And so as I got older and I found out a little more about the folks who were there, I asked my dad to preserve these stories in the form of a memoir. And he resisted because he didn't want to take time out to look at the past while he had the energy to pursue new projects. And he preferred to look towards the future and determine his priorities for the present. So he just refused to write anything down and to take the time aside to work on the book. Fortunately, later on in his life, when his energies were a bit diminished, Elie Wiesel, a friend of my father's, did prevail on him to record his life's events. And my father, having both an excellent memory and a very meticulous filing system, finally agreed in his 80s to sit down and commit to writing the events of his life. And when I look at them, I am pretty much in awe because my father lived in a period of time which was fast changing and turbulent and very, very unpredictable. And he found his way to get involved and undertake, sometimes at great personal risk, initiatives that in small measures became game changers. My father had a friend, Professor Israel Eldad, who some might recognize from his Lehi fame. And he used to say, a prophet isn't someone who can tell the future. A prophet is someone who understands the present. And very much by understanding the present, you can see where events will lead to and how they will likely unfold. And it's that kind of insight that my father did have, which often placed his thinking ahead of his time. My father grew up in Vienna. His upbringing was an interesting combination of religious and nationalist. Religious in the sense that his family was observant and followed, although in a more modern way, the teachings of the Hasidim of Chodkov. And then as far as his Zionism, that basically evolved by his witnessing violent anti-Semitism in Vienna and seeing how Jabotinsky's disciples in the Beitar youth movement took it upon themselves to combat the thugs who were beating Jews up. And inspired by this bravery, my father was attracted to learn more about the movement and join it. And these two currents of love for Jewish tradition and lifestyle on the one hand, and national pride and courage on the other, really came to inform his choices in life. For those who've had a chance to go through the book, my father witnessed a Jewish student being thrown out of the window of the University of Vienna. And although the Jewish community protested to the municipality about this campus violence, at the time, the police were not allowed to enter the university. And so this was continuing regularly. And until having the regular appeals having failed, a group of followers of Jabotinsky lined the entrance to the university with bats and basically beat up those students who came in wearing swastikas. And when those students were being hospitalized, the Vienna Council met and decided to change the regulations and allow police to patrol the university and ensure student safety. And this event inspired my father to join and participate in the leadership training programs, the Jewish history programs, the self-defense programs, and learn about Jewish history from a very, very positive and affirming way. Our people have a tradition of 3,500 years tying us to our land and our belief system. And part of the Beitar education was to be conversant with it, with our history, and also with our language, and encourage the speaking of Hebrew. When the Nazis entered Vienna during the Anschluss in March of 1938, a group of Jews saw how the Nazis were rounding up Jews and imprisoning them just before Passover. And there was a fellow in the Aguda named Wolf Pappenheim who agreed to finance the provision of kosher food, the providing of kosher food to the 19 prisons in Vienna. And my father volunteered to make those deliveries. And so he would go in a vehicle driven by an Aryan driver bearing a Nazi flag on it into the prisons, go through the front entrance. After it was closed, get admitted through the second entrance. It was a Sally Port system. And then he would unload the boxes and go back and refill for the next visit. And I remember him telling me the hardest place to stop was the youth prison, because the kids who were wandering around there were his age. And in essence, if not the grace of God, he would have been in there with them. And it was also very uncertain that they would let him out. But he did make those deliveries. And he felt that this movement, and he took great pride in the fact that it felt responsible for the community and met their needs. Another aspect of his involvement with Beitar was his selection by Otto Zeidman, who was the head of Beitar in Vienna, who chose my father as a teenager to coordinate the beginnings of what was later called the clandestine immigration to Israel. Jews were beginning to realize that the gates to Israel were closed by the British, and so the leaders who were following events wanted to find an alternate route of bringing Jews to Israel, and they felt that the sea was an option. So a fellow named Galili had an idea, which he piloted by sending several small vessels with Jewish kids to Israel, successfully evading the British blockade. And my father was asked to get the word out in Vienna and organize the transport of Jews from Europe to Israel using Greek vessels that the revisionists had hired to do the actual transport. And my father led such a group, in addition to organizing several others. As you probably read in the book, his transport was stopped at the Italian border because it turned out that the boat that was originally hired was actually non-existent, and the community was defrauded. And so Hacohen, who didn't want the Jews to leave in the first place, had to train on a sidetrack for 2 weeks and then return to Vienna. My father made arrangements in Vienna to reabsorb the group, house them in the community center, and dispatch them on the Danube, which was international waters, to get to another boat in Italy. And then he was instructed to fly to Fiume to pick up the balance of the group that made it from other European nations for the journey to Israel. In the interim, they had secured another boat called the Draga 1. The Draga made the voyage. When they were rounding Athens, the crew called a strike. They wanted higher wages. There was a lot of tension till negotiations were concluded and the trip continued, and the boat was safely brought into Israel on Kol Nidre night, 1938. So my father reached the shores at that point. His colleague on the boat was a fellow named Shmuel Dagansky, whose nickname was Johnny. And there was another fellow who served as on the upper deck, watching the captain, who was trained in the Beitar Naval Academy. And European Jews on the whole were very, very uncomfortable with a lot of this activity because they felt, what are Jews setting up a naval academy for? And this was a very, very wise decision with a lot of foresight, because the graduates of these programs served to supervise the illegal boats to ensure that they were in fact heading to Israel and not being diverted to other locations. With the boat arriving in Israel, there was a group to welcome the Jews on shore and disperse them among the population. And my father went about bringing his parents legally, quote, legally, through the regular British visa system. He himself was too proud to come that way, although his uncle, who was in Israel, sent him visas, because my father felt, as a proud Jew, that the British had no authority to admit Jews or refuse Jews to Israel. And on principle, he wanted to save others and bypass that that practice. Anyway, my father joined the Irgun when he was in Israel and began his studies at Hebrew University. For a while, he had a side business selling textiles and feathers to support his parents, who were elderly. And the war broke out. When the war broke out, my father was in Jerusalem. At the time of the siege, he and another man, Mark Aviezer, took the initiative and began a census of people living in apartment buildings, so that, God forbid, when an explosion would occur, the rescue groups would know how many people to look for and who they were looking for. This was coordinated and supervised by a professor's Italian origin from the Hebrew University, who himself was killed standing guard in front of the Orient Theater in Jerusalem. This Mark Aviezer was one of the guests whose name appeared in the guest book and whom I remember very fondly visiting quite often at my parents' home. My father studied political science at the Hebrew University. However, when he heard about an opportunity to study public administration, he applied to the program that was initiated by Viscount, at that time, Edwin Samuel, Herbert Samuel's son. Edwin Samuel was a very fascinating individual in his own right. He was brought up in England. He was very familiar with the British military system as well as government. And Abba Eben, who was one of his colleagues, set up this program for teaching future civil servants and public administrators for the future government of Israel. The notion that when you have a country after 2,000 years, you need to have people who are familiar with how to operate one. And that was, my father was involved in getting that program off the ground. First, he entered as a student, and he was invited to as well be part of the administration of the program. When parts of the city fell to the Arabs, the library of this institution was transferred to a safe zone by my father, who snuck the books over in an interesting operation described in the book. When, after the War of Independence, Ben-Gurion invited my father to be part of a committee for supervising these government structures. And my father also was hired by Walter Eitan in the foreign ministry to set up the first 46 legations and embassies, as well as to recruit the personnel and write the procedural manuals for those embassies. There was a fellow from Vienna who identified my father as having been a follower of Jabotinsky. And the nature of the time was that there was a tremendous amount of polarization in Israel, not unlike what we see today in America and in other places in the world. And if you weren't part of the right political party, your future was definitely at risk. My father noticed that the Mapai Party was holding partisan political events on government facilities and registered his protest. He was unhappy with the discriminatory practices against members of who were not of the prevailing Mapai Party. And when a guard revealed that my father was a follower of Jabotinsky, my father was called in and given the choice of either joining the party or told to prepare for some career reassignment. at which point my father decided to leave Israel and return to his studies. He went for his doctorate in New York, and his thesis was on providing hydroelectric power to the Negev using generators, which would be placed on a canal to be built from the Mediterranean to the Dead Sea. This project, Dead Med project, keeps surfacing every decade or so. Israel typically doesn't have the funds for it. But back then, my father was already anticipating the need for hydroelectric power for the country and desalinization of water for irrigation of the Negev, and really a very climate-friendly energy, alternative source of energy. And this is in the early 50s. After he completed his doctoral studies at the New School of Social Research in Columbia, my father was introduced to Isaac Shalom, who I mentioned earlier, and was fascinated by the prospect of setting up Jewish schools in Muslim countries. With an American passport, he had access and frequently visited Iran and Morocco and France, which had housed Sephardic communities that fled from Algeria and Libya and Lebanon, and whose youth were at risk of assimilation. The Otzar Torah network provided not only religious studies, but also technical studies in cooperation with ORT, so that the students had a half day of Jewish studies, a half a day of vocational and secular studies. And of the over 24,000 students who went through the system, I have on many occasions met either family members or students themselves who had been through the program and credited it with being a key turning point in their life. My father worked with Otzar Torah till 1966. At that point, he decided to switch careers to allow him to be closer to home. And my father joined an American Bank and Trust Company and continued his communal work through his banking activities. He would use the branches of the bank to showcase the work of Israeli artists. He would be involved in setting up conferences to connect Israeli entrepreneurs with American investors. He would introduce scientists and technology people to funders. And he was also very active in helping many educational institutions. My father joined the original board of Touro College, who was a big supporter of the Jerusalem College of Technology in Israel, Shari Chesed Hospital. And when my father was invited to speak in Switzerland on one occasion for Yom Ha'atzmaut, he was advised by Isaac Shalom that a friend of his, Mr. Laniato, had recently passed away, childless, leaving a fortune of, at the time, $1,800,000 in Swiss accounts. Mr. Laniato was actually Parisian, but would visit Switzerland and was never granted residency. He would always have to reapply as a visitor. On hearing that Mr. Laniato was in the hospital, the Swiss decided to grant him residency just before he died so that they could impose a death tax of $1.5 million on his estate. And Isaac Shalom felt very upset about this. And so he asked my father to try and intervene. So when my father was invited to speak in front of the community at an Israel Independence Day event, he called out the Swiss government for this money grab. And part of the day, on the dais, was a Swiss senator named Mr. Fiss, who was very embarrassed by this greed and worked to changed things so that only 300,000 of that estate was taken by the Swiss, and 500,000 was then forwarded to each of what became the Laniado Hospital in Netanya, the Porat Yosef Yeshiva in Jerusalem, and the remaining 500,000 to a girls' school in Bnei Brak. And my father was very pleased to have played the role to bring that change about. In his later years, he was involved in the battle for Hasbara. Following the Six-Day War, he went to Washington and met with members of Congress and went on a speaking tour to fight the misuse of the terms occupied territory and West Bank and the notion of returning territory, and instead corrected his former colleagues from Israel's foreign ministry that these terms would come back to haunt us. Because if Judea and Samaria were not identified as such, and the areas captured during the Six-Day War were not identified as liberated or at least administered territories, the term occupied with the connotation from the Second World War would indicate that these did not belong to Jews. And indeed, today we see the same problem where people challenge whether Jews are the indigenous population of Israel. And this, of course, was contributed by these misconceptions that we've, as a community, allowed to continue. As I said, my father spent the latter part of his career working to reform Israel's economy and liberalize it so that foreign investment could find its way to what would popularly become the startup nation. When Benjamin Netanyahu was the finance minister and was speaking in New York, I noticed my father in the audience and singled him out during his talk as having really been a major contributor to the reform movement, reforming the economic restrictions that were notoriously hurting Israel's economy. And finally, he, as age caught up with him, he needed to wind down. And so the time was ripe for him to write this book. I think that as American Jews who have grown up in the safety and security here in the United States, it's very hard to imagine the status of European Jews before the war, in the sense that they had a horrific experience of persecution and discrimination. And so for them to get accepted into society that was constantly vilifying them was a big challenge. And by having the positive influences of a Zionist movement that taught Jewish pride and a religious movement that taught love of our fellow man and loving kindness and doing random acts of kindness, community kindness, it basically informed my father's outlook on things that needed to be done. And one of the takeaways I had from him was, just because you haven't done it before doesn't mean you can't do it. And he really applied that in many, many areas. My father was notified by a relative of mine in Israel that a member of his community had a heart issue. My father arranged for this person to be treated by the teacher of the first of the doctor who conducted the first transplant. My father was a genius at finding networking connections that people just didn't see, but he always said that, the way you look at things depends on what you see. And if you want to get something done, you can find a way to do it, often find a way to do it. And when I compare his environment of growing up with the kind of anti-Semitism we find today in the media, in academia, in the government. I mean, we just had that Texas hostage situation, and the FBI director says that you can't really attribute it as a hate crime. This is just really, really very disconcerting, very, very disconcerting. And the physical violence against Jews and the silence of a lot of the establishment in tolerating this. We need a new burst of leadership. We need people with vision. We need a community that will care about each other much more and restore civil discourse and conversations. My father used to read newspapers from the left to the right, from the religious to the secular, and from countries all around the world. He never relied on his sources of information to be, based on only one or two sources. And he always respected other people's opinions. And I think that that's something that's sorely lacking today. And I hope that individually our challenge will be to restore that. One of the things that my father pointed out in the book was that he really wanted people to recognize the challenges of the times and to act on them and to feel confident in acting on them. Because when you step forward, it takes courage, but it also attracts other people who step up to help. And that's really the way things change and improve. So in ways, my father wanted both to recognize the unsung heroes and the unknown soldiers whose efforts really helped establish the state and who change and improve Jewish life on a daily basis, and to encourage others to take up the torch. Anyway, I wanted very much to give people a chance to share their thoughts. And so I think I'll pause here and take questions, if that would be all right.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Yisrael. 1 second. Thank you so much. That was a really fascinating presentation. And I think it also shows how important it is for people to write down their memories of their experiences. There's so many people who have made incredible contributions, and we'd love to feature them also in the book club. But it's important for posterity to speak about these events. There are a number of events that that you talk about in the book that I would love if you could tell the stories about, but maybe I'll turn to that later. Including the story of the Kotel, trying to blow the shofar at the Kotel at the time when the British were arresting people and imprisoning people for doing that, and also his involvement in Golda Meir becoming the Israeli ambassador to Moscow. Another one is the soccer field, which became an airport in Jerusalem. And I know your father, had interesting things to say about all these stories. But
I'm very proud of you, Liz. You really did a thorough job. I had a difficult time really deciding on what to focus on. Recapping, the book and my dad's sort of the other additional things that were left out of it. So,
one other thing that your dad worked for ZOA's youth department.
Yes, I was surprised and delighted to find out for a short time, he was the youth director before he got accepted to the graduate program. Uh-huh. He didn't get a student visa, but in the interim, he was still able to arrange some socials and lectures, and I'm very proud of that.
Uh-huh. So, let me open this up for other questions right now, and then maybe you could go back and speak about some of those wonderful stories. We have a question from Michael Goodman in the chat. How long was Bataar active in Vienna following the Anschluss, if you know? I mean, I know you're speaking about your father's experience. You may not know the answers to
Well,
all questions.
um, there were, and it deserves a very nuanced answer. There were about a dozen and a half branches of Beitar across the city. On the evening of the Anschluss, members of each of those chapters were instructed to go and clear out all and destroy all the membership files in the offices and to bring the flags to Israel. And if you go to the Jabotinsky Institute, Beit Jabotinsky in Tel Aviv, you will see that all 17 flags of Vienna, Beitar, were rescued and found a home there. As far as the activities of the Beitar after the Anschluss, I don't really know a lot of details about it. I know that, unfortunately, between the British limitations on visas to Israel and also the Jewish agencies' behavior applying politics to the accepting of and the issuing of visas to people coming from Europe, a lot of followers of Jabotinsky, whether they were in the Beitar or the revisionist movement, were bypassed and they were overlooked. I mean, Vienna had a nice Beitar, but Poland's had over 100,000 members, and unfortunately, most of them did not survive. The tragedy was that after the war, I mean, Jabotinsky died in 1940 in exile because the British would not allow him to be in Israel. And after the war, you had many Beitarim going into the Irgun and helping with the evacuation and rescue of refugees and survivors of the Holocaust from Europe. But unfortunately, the movement was not really sustained in the way like Bnei Akiva or Shomer HaTzair or some of the other Zionist movements were. And so it really remained a very, very small shadow of itself afterwards. The biggest thing of Beitar that one finds is the soccer team of Jerusalem, and that's and the scattered memorials around the country, and it's sad.
Let's see. Okay, we also have a question from Joseph Levin. What was your father's perspective on the Lazarov affair, if he had one?
Oh, the thing is that the Lazarov affair was unfortunately just for those who may not be aware, Lazarov was a labor leader who was murdered while walking on the beach, I believe in Tel Aviv. Mm-hmm. And even though, and this was a cause célèbre that the left parties used to defame the followers of Jabotinsky, who were later vindicated. But during the course of the trial, Stavsky and two other members were put on trial, and they were vindicated. They were found innocent, as although the person who perpetrated the murder was Arab. I don't think that he was ever caught, but that my father was definitely very clear that murder was not something that the right would have been involved with, certainly not on a political level. I stress that because I understand that during the time of the underground, there were Jews who were betraying other Jews to the British, and who may have had met their fate otherwise. But as for political reasons, murder was certainly not something that Jabotinsky's followers would countenance.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. Could you speak about the story about the Kotel now, and how the British were?
rioted in Jerusalem, and they were complaining that during Rosh Hashanah and the conclusion of Yom Kippur, the shofar blowing was disturbing the services on the Temple Mount. So the British decided to prohibit the blowing of the shofar. And in a show of Jewish defiance, the members of the Beitar organized a group of people who would go to the Kotel and at the conclusion of Yom Kippur blow the shofar. And the British was very often simply arrest them and imprison them for 6 months for this public disturbance. In the last event in 1947, the Beitar pulled an interesting stunt. They had an individual imitate the sound of the shofar. Remember, the Kotel in those days was not what it looks like now. It was a very narrow alley. So this individual faked the sound from the far end. When the British at the entrance were making their way towards the corner, the Beitarim started singing the national anthem, the Hatikva, which by protocol the British had to stand at attention. In the meantime, the Beitari who actually blew the real shofar was at the entrance. He did blow the shofar and got away before he could be apprehended. So the Plugat HaKotel, which represented the people who successfully or unsuccessfully blew the shofar and got away with it or didn't, maintained a group identity for many years after. And my father was present during that event with the Plugat HaKotel blowing the shofar at the wall.
And could you just...
So you mentioned...
go ahead.
The airport, my dad had a cousin who was a soccer player and who requested the clearing of a field in Yerushalayim for a soccer field. And even though the dimensions that were being cleared of rocks was much larger than what would be needed for small aircraft, rather for soccer, the real intent was to provide the capability of having an airfield in Jerusalem. And this was subsequently used by Golda Meir to get to the city, as well as other folks. And it was just another one of the ruses. I mean, those who visit Israel and have seen the underground bullet factory that was used by the Palmach, it's really, there are a lot of similar stories where by necessity, the Jews of Israel who were disarmed by the British needed to innovate the circumstances to be able to protect themselves. So the airfield was just another such story in the annals of those efforts. It's hard. They say that people who are in the midst of a miracle don't recognize its magnitude. And I think that our generation is really blessed to be at a time when we have a state of Israel that's strong and independent, and both a leader in every area of technology, of agriculture, of science, of water management. Israel is the only country on the planet that has more forests every year than the year before. There are 200 nations that are going to Israel for advice on feeding their populations and developing water systems. I mean, from 100 years ago to today, who would have imagined this? And peace treaties today with adversaries, these are game changers. There was a time when no one would deal with Israel from the other side. I mean, and now, the East is coming closer to Israel, and the West is becoming increasingly anti-Semitic. It's what the Chinese would call very interesting times.
Steve Feldman, and he asked a very important question, which is, maybe based on your father's teachings, because your father worked with youth so much. What can each of us do to get more young and not so young Jews, whether in schools, shuls, and elsewhere, to learn more about Jabotinsky, your father, Bitar, and other heroes, in addition to your book, and why, in your opinion, are they not taught about them?
Okay. that's, in my opinion, recognizing a very critical and underserved need. I believe that Jewish education is a vital part of our survival. And I think people have to undertake learning as a lifelong process. There is no lack of wealth of information, but the issue is that what's the word I'm looking for? Basically, fact-based evidence is something that has to be reintroduced. Everything today is coming across as spin. And, people like to speak truth to power, and they like to have their own truth. But the reality is people don't own the truth. The truth is the truth. If people don't like the truth and they want to, present spin, it has to be called out. And it can only be called out by people who have the knowledge to call it out. And so the prerequisite is really just learning our history. When you go to Israel with the Bible and you see the places where things took place yet thousands of years ago, you don't really leave with an impression that you're not an indigenous member of the population. But for others who don't have that experience, they have to be shown that this is the case. Archaeology bears out so much of our history, and it just needs to be presented to the public. So to answer your question, I think we have to have more events. We have to have opportunities to introduce the uninitiated to the beauties of Israel, to the richness and culture and contributions of the country to others. I think that we need to celebrate it amongst ourselves more than it is. I think that social media is a very, very overlooked area, because I think if there were apps on Jewish history, apps on Jewish customs and personalities I think that this would be enormous at spreading information to people. I think it's underused. One of the things that my father was always critical was Israel's hasbara. Honestly, I don't know. I mean, I know that we didn't get our message across, and still don't very in the right sound bites. But I really feel that we get deplatformed a lot. We're not really even given a fighting chance in many arenas of public opinion, and I think that that's a very big challenge in itself. There are a lot of universities where people are just afraid, intimidated, harassed, and so dissociate themselves from Israel. And this has got to change. There's got to be a positive presence on campus to encourage identifying with Israel and supporting Israel. And I think that that's what we need to focus on. We need to create these events. We need to invite people. We have to, disseminate material and use social media. I mean, that's where people are getting their news today. And the other thing is, we need to write to political leaders and to decision makers and voice our opinions. Because if they don't hear from us, then you can't expect to change their mind. And at least they should know that there is some pushback. There are people watching them. And ZOA, by the way, is a great group to do that with, because they're on campus and they're running these programs. And we really need to get more people to come to them. We need to invite our friends. We need to invite to get the word out in other circles, because I think that's how people's attention is drawn to these points.
And thank you so much for mentioning ZOA's huge involvement in this. And, I do want to mention to everybody on the call that we have programs. And if you have a synagogue or school or religious school that you're affiliated with that would like to have one of our programs, we would love to run it for them. Just let us know. Let me know, or let Alan J know. And we'll be there, when we've run programs like this for college students and with other organizations and so on. And do you have time for one more story to tell us about Golda Meir? And your father, helping her go to Russia to represent the state of Israel when it was newly reconstituted.
Right. Well, Golda Meir was, of course, born in Russia, and she very much sought the role of Israel's ambassador to the Soviet Union, to Russia, once the state was established. And she campaigned very, very actively to get that appointment. And there was a lot of debate. Some members of labor were not excited about her being there, but she prevailed. And when she went to, my father was one of the team to brief her about her role in Russia. And my father, as the only religious member of the group, came up with the idea of taking the pulse of Russian Jewry. After all, this was in the early 50s. I think it was 1950 or in 1949 when Israel was sending its first ambassador there, and we had and Soviet Jewry was pretty much cut off from the world after the war, and certainly since, in many cases, since the revolution. So my father proposed to take the pulse of Jewish identification after years of communist suppression and oppression. And he suggested that Golda Meir make a visit to the Moscow synagogue on Rosh Hashanah. And to facilitate that, he got in touch with the president of the Great Synagogue in Tel Aviv to supply the Torah and Telesim and Machzorim and Sidurim and Chumashim, and all of these contributed religious articles were then sent to Moscow from Israel as diplomatic, under diplomatic, diplomatic luggage, so that the Soviets could not confiscate it, and it was insured to get to the synagogue. And so the shul would have what it needed for services. And in addition, my father started a whispering campaign in the streets of Moscow that Golda Meir would come to shul. And as it turns out, the Russians were blown away by the over 50,000 Jews who lined the streets from Golda Meir's hotel to the synagogue and accompanied her there. And the Russians were totally taken by surprise at this outpouring of Jewish identification after such a long time of being in isolation. And Golda Meir writes about it in her biography as well. And this was really a game changer in the sense that all of a sudden Soviet Jewry was recognized as being still around and still identifying. My father that was one of the things that my father was also very proud about, was the role he played in this process. That story was also in the book for those of you who haven't had a chance to read it yet.
Thank you.
It's amazing. We have so many hidden gems. I mean, the Hasidic masters say that there are these sparks, Jewish sparks, that are all over, and you just never know what will ignite them. And, when there is a Jewish opportunity, the magnetism is there, the attraction is there, and it brings people out who you'd never expect. There was Molotov's wife. Molotov was the Russian who negotiated the Molotov-Ribbentrop Accords between the Nazis and the communists. So his wife was Jewish. And when they had a reception for Golda Meir, his wife went over to Golda and told her, Ich bin a Yiddische Tochter. I'm a Jewish daughter. So Golda Meir smiled. Shortly after that event, Mrs. Ribbentrop was sent to a gulag, and she was not heard of until after the passing of Joseph Stalin, at which point her husband pulled strings and got back together again with her. But it shows you the extent of the animosity towards Jews and how risky it was. Another story that's in the book is how when my father received the Russians ambassador, the first thing they did when they walked into their suite at the hotel was to check for bugs. They went all around looking for microphones. And he contrasted that with the arrival of James McDonald, who was the American ambassador, who arrived in Israel with a very positive, unsuspicious, but warm and friendly manner, and introduced his daughter, who spoke Hebrew, and the totally tremendous contrast between the two. So, again, my father was fortunate to live through interesting times. We are fortunate that he was what I call persuaded to record them. And I find this both gratifying and entertaining to revisit from time to time, because it does reconnect me with my father and with events that affected our people so much in the not so distant past.
He was certainly an inspiration to all of us. And, thank you so much for sharing so much about the book with us. So we really appreciate it. By the way, one of the people in the chat, Michael Ranan, wrote, my parents knew Dr. Hacohen in the U.S. I have a picture of him here here from the Jabotinsky Centennial Dinner in November 1980, which they also attended, which is nice to see. And you have a lot of other comments thanking you for this wonderful presentation. And thank you very much.
You're very kind. Thank you.
Thank you to everybody for joining us. Please, contribute to ZOA so we continue our important work, ZOA.org, and have a wonderful week, everybody. And we look forward to seeing you at our upcoming events. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double high or more. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, Post Office Box 360, Stamford, Connecticut 06904. Or you can call the JBS Pledge Line at 833-MY-JBS-TV. That's 833-695-2788. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. We thank you for your kind support.